Hi, friends. My name is Victoria, and I work for a place called the Steelworks Museum. Have you ever heard of this place before? The Steelworks Museum? Well, here at the museum, we teach people about steel, how it's made, the people who work together to make the steel. We teach people about what can be done with steel products once they're made. We also teach people about a very special place in Pueblo's history called the steel mill. And here in Pueblo, our steel mill for more than 100 years was called the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. We call it CF&I for short. Today, this place is called Evraz. So today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of the jobs that is very important in the steel making process. And this job is called a scientist. So let me share my screen here so that you can see some pictures and follow along. So throughout CF&I's history and even today, there were many different types of jobs. But like I said, we're going to talk about scientists today. So this picture here on the left is a scientist. You might call him a doctor, but doctors are scientists as well. And he's examining a patient. Inside of a steel mill, it is very, very dangerous type of environment. And so CF&I had its own doctors and nurses and surgeons and other medical people that worked together to help care for workers if they got sick or hurt on the job, and also to make sure that they were doing a safe job while they were at work. This picture in the middle is a different type of scientist, and his job was called a geologist. And geologists study rocks and minerals and the earth so that those rocks and minerals could then be turned into steel. This job here on the right is a different type of scientist, and this job is called a chemist. And chemists, obviously, they study chemistry, and they study the ways that different materials and different liquids interact with each other or react to each other. And this is important because if two materials don't work well together, that could actually make the steel weak, or on the other side, it could also make the steel very, very strong when it's being made and when those final products are made from the steel, the finished product. You want to have something that's very, very strong. So a chemist is a different type of scientist that works with the steel industry. So all scientists, they do three main things in their job. They observe, and this could be the world around them, or they could also observe their experiment that they're conducting. They use all of their senses. They look using their eyes, they look at the experiment, they look at different ways that things react or interact with their experiment. They listen to other scientists. They also listen sometimes to the experiment, noticing any changes that might happen. Sometimes they smell their experiment to notice any odors that might come off of their experiment. And that might give them a clue that maybe something's going right or something's not going quite the way that they wanted. They feel their experiment sometimes, using either tools like scales or maybe even their hands. Sometimes, not so much in the steel industry, but sometimes scientists might even taste their experiment. For example, if you're a scientist that is a flavor scientist and you work for an ice cream company, You might want to taste your experiment to see if the flavor that you're hoping for is just the right flavor. In the steel industry, scientists don't taste the steel, but in other industries, they might. Scientists also measure while they're conducting their experiment. And by measure, that can mean a lot of different things. They might use scales to measure the weight of something. In the steel industry, they measure in tons, not in pounds. They might measure using a ruler and measure the length of something. They might use a thermometer to measure the temperature of their experiment, if it's really, really hot, really, really cold. So scientists use different types of tools to measure experiments. And then they also communicate with other scientists. They write reports and sometimes they write books that tell others about their experiment and their experiences. Sometimes they just talk to other scientists and get feedback about what they did right or how they can improve next time. So scientists do lots of different types of things in their work. This is a picture of another scientist that worked for CF&I. She lived a long, long time ago. Her name was Josephine Dunlap, and this picture was actually taken over 100 years ago. She started working for CF&I in 1910. She worked for the company until 1939, and she was a special type of doctor called a pathologist. And a pathologist is a doctor that studies germs and bacteria and the ways that germs and bacteria can make you sick, why some people get sick and other people stay healthy. Pathologists also study prevention in preventing people from getting sick. And they also study, if you do get sick, how quickly you can start feeling better again. So that was her type of science that she studied. This is another picture of Dr. Dunlap and her assistants. Dr. Dunlap is the lady in the middle of the picture, hiding behind that shelf. While she was at CF&I, she did lots and lots of different experiments. And she used all three of those things that we talked about earlier. She observed her patients. She took their temperature and measured their how hot they are, or if they were chilly and needed blankets or sweaters. She also communicated with the progress made on her patients. She wrote different papers and reports about the progress that was being made in her work. A couple of things that she did that are really exciting in the medical world. In the early 1900s in the United States, there was a disease that went around and it was called typhoid. And this is a very serious disease. A lot of people can get sick and you can even die from typhoid. But she studied typhoid among patients that worked for CF&I. And she helped to discover that typhoid was spread through water that had bacteria in it. And so she worked with other doctors to clean the water that CF&I workers used, either to drink or used in their food or used to wash their dishes. And so by cleaning the water and getting rid of the bacteria, she and her other doctors that she worked with were able to get rid of typhoid among CF&I workers in the early 1900s. Another piece of work that she did was in 1918, there was what was called a worldwide pandemic. You might have heard that word recently. It's you hear it a lot in the news nowadays. But a pandemic In 1918, it was called influenza. And this was a disease that was spread through the air, and people, if they got this disease, it made them very, very hard to breathe. And so she and her fellow doctors that she worked with studied this disease and figured out ways to prevent the disease from spreading in Pueblo and in other places around southern Colorado. She and her other doctors and nurses also gave out vaccines. You might have heard that word a lot lately. That it was called a influenza vaccine to prevent people from getting the influenza virus in the future. In the 1920s, Dr. Dunlap also worked and studied a hormone in your body called insulin. And this helps to regulate the amount of sugar that you have in your blood. And she did a lot of research and a lot of work with insulin to help patients who have diabetes. It's a disease that your body does not produce enough insulin. And so she did a lot of work with researching insulin and how to help patients with diabetes in the 1920s. So I'm going to read a little story here, and it's called Ada Twist Scientist. And this is a story about a kid scientist and her work that she did, and she studied the world around her. So Ada Twist Scientist was written by Andrea Beatty and illustrated by David Roberts. Ada Marie, said not a word till the day she turned 3. She bounced in her crib and looked all around, observing the world, but not making a sound. She learned how to climb and made her big break, with a trail of chaos left in her wake. She ran through the day, chasing each sound in sight, and didn't slow down till she conked out at night. Her parents were frazzled, but tried not to freak, as Ada grew bigger and still did not speak. Clearly, young Ada, with lots in her head, would have something to say when it ought to be said. That's just what happened when Ada turned 3. She tore through the house on a fact-finding spree and climbed up the clock just as high as she could. Her parents yelled, "Stop!" as all good parents would. Ada's chin quivered, but she did not cry. She took a deep breath and she simply asked, "Why? Why does it tick and why does it talk? Why don't we call it a granddaughter clock? Why are there pointy things stuck to a rose? Why are there hairs up inside of your nose?" She started with why, and then what, how, and when. By bedtime, she came back to why once again. She drifted to sleep as her dazed parents smiled at the curious thoughts of their curious child, who wanted to know what the world was about. They kissed her and whispered, "You'll figure it out." Her parents kept up with their high-flying kid, whose questions and chaos both grew as she did. Even Miss Greer found her hands were quite full when young Ada's chaos wreaked havoc at school. But this much was clear about Miss Ada Twist. She had all the traits of a great scientist. Ada was busy that first day of spring, testing the sounds that make mockingbirds sing. when a horrible stench whacked her right in the nose, a pungent aroma that curled up her toes. Zowie, said Ada, which got her to thinking, what is the source of that terrible stinking? How does a nose know there's something to smell? And does it still stink if there's no nose to tell? She rattled off questions and tapped on her chin. She'd start at the start, where she ought to begin. A mystery, a riddle, a puzzle, a quest. This was the moment that Ada loved best. Ada did research to learn all she could of smelling and smells, both stinky and good. One hypothesis Ada thought could be true. The terrible stink came from Dad's cabbage stew. She tested and tested, but soon Ada knew it was time to come up with hypothesis 2. Then zowie, the stink struck again, just like that. Hypothesis 2, it's caused by the cat. The cat couldn't make such a stink on its own. It needed perfume and some fancy cologne. So young Ada tested. The test was a flop. She started again, but her parents yelled, "Stop!" Ada Marie, to the thinking chair now by the time we count 3. Enough, said her mother. That's it, said her dad. Her parents were frustrated, frazzled, and mad. Why? Ada questioned. Her mother said no. What? Ada queried. Her father said, go. You've ruined our supper. You've made the cat stink. Enough with your questions. Now sit there and think. She looked at her parents. Her heart turned to goo. Poor Ada Twist didn't know what to do. She sat all alone by herself in the hall, and Ada once more could say nothing at all. And so Ada sat, and she sat, and she sat, and she thought about science and Stu and the cat, and how her experiments made such a big mess. Does it have to be so? Is that part of success? Are messes a problem? And while she was thinking, what was the source of that terrible stinking? Ada Marie did what scientists do. She asked a small question, and then she asked 2. And each of those led her to 3 questions more. And some of those questions resulted in 4. As Ada got thinking, she really dug in. She scribbled her questions and tapped on her chin. She started at why, and then what, how, and when. At the end of the hall, she reached why once again. Her parents calmed down. They came back to talk. They looked at the hallway and just had to gawk. No patch of bare paint could be seen on the wall. The thinking chair now was the great thinking hall. They watched their young daughter and sighed as they did. What would they do with this curious kid who wanted to know what the world was about? They smiled and whispered, we'll figure it out. And that's what they did, because that's what you do. When your kid has a passion and heart that is true, they remade their world. Now they're all in the act of helping young Ada sort fiction from fact. She asks lots of questions. How could she resist? It's all in the heart of a young scientist. And as for that smell, What can Ada Twist do but learn all she could with her friends in grade 2? Will they discover the stink that curls toes? Well, that is the question. And someday, who knows? Well, I hope that you enjoyed that story, and I hope that you are a curious scientist and that you continue your studies about steel, about Pueblo, and lots of other things as you go through the rest of this school year. So thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.